Well, everybody, how are we doing today? Welcome to our Bible study. Did y'all not know it's spring break? Okay, all right. Well, I do, and my intent was to just be right here doing my job, what I'm supposed to be doing. And my wife, have y'all met Cindy? Yeah, she turns out that I'm driving her and my grandchildren to Galveston today. So anyway, okay, good. And I'm excited. Anyway, we'll see. But my grandchildren are excited, which makes it fun, right? Anyway, okay. All right. So welcome. If you're online, welcome. We're glad you're here. And we're glad you're here in this room today. And we are going to continue our journey. Appreciate Kurt teaching for me last Wednesday. We were at Ascent and had a great time there, but we are back here today and grateful to be here. So, but let's look at John 2, and we're going to look at the cleansing of the temple. And so let's look at the text. I'm going to read it for us, and we'll walk through our outline today. But John 2, verse 13, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all of them from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers, and he overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all of this?" Jesus answered, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They replied, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days." But the temple he had spoken of was his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples recalled what he had said. And then they believed the scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and believed in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. Okay, so let's start with what actually happened, okay? And so, John, we're so grateful for the details that John gives us, because John has 3 Passovers in his telling of the story of Jesus that help us to know that the ministry of Jesus lasted at least that long. The synoptic writers only have 1 Passover, and so we know that the ministry of Jesus lasted longer than a year because of John's gospel. So Jesus, as best we can tell, is in Jerusalem early in his ministry, and here's what's happened. The Jewish leaders had allowed the commercial business that was associated with exchanging your money where you could pay the temple tax and sacrifices. Historically, at least as best, we don't know everything, but as best we can tell, all of that was located across the Kidron Valley for a long time. So in other words, as you made your way into Jerusalem, a lot of people, as they were traveling to Jerusalem for Passover, they might not be able to bring their choicest lamb or their doves or pigeons. And depending on where they came from, they had the wrong currency, if you will. And so they could stop at one of these markets and they could purchase the animals that they needed for a sacrifice that had been blessed by the priests and would be approved for them to offer up. Or if they were poor, they could buy pigeons or doves, and they could also exchange their money so that they didn't bring foreign currency into the temple treasury. There were a couple of reasons for that. The Jews were very particular about the kind of money that could be brought into the temple treasury. And also, if you remember, in the ancient world, it was very common to put images of pagan leaders on coinage. And so there was a little bit of concern about bringing pagan images into the temple treasury. But one of the real concerns was not all coinage was done with the same quality. And so the Jews had a very strict way of making their coins, and they only wanted the best coins in the temple treasury. So you would exchange your money, purchase whatever animal you might need to make for a sacrifice, etc. You could do that. However, by the time you get to this particular period, they have allowed that to actually be moved onto the temple grounds. And it had to have been located in an area known as the court of the Gentiles. So when you made your way into the temple, and Herod had expanded the temple complex, he has been working on it for 46 years. Now, he's dead by now when you get to this part of the story. But about 20 BC, somewhere in there, we're not really sure of exactly, but best we can tell, somewhere in that neighborhood, he started construction. And so now, so you had this massive building, and when you came in the main gates, you had a huge courtyard where anybody could go. It didn't matter who you were. And we have found some archaeological evidence to show us that there was a restriction to move past the court of the Gentiles. So we actually have an ancient stone inscription basically warning Gentiles, you can't go any further on pain of death. So you can't make your way further to the interior of the temple. But you could gather outside, inside the massive courtyard. However, by the time Jesus gets there, these markets are no longer just out in the Kidron Valley. There were probably still some there. But now there are others actually on the temple grounds themselves. Now, here's what could possibly be true. They could have been characterized at this time by graft and greed. In other words, once you have people inside the temple grounds and they know they've got to make sacrifices and you're the only one selling them, then what would that breed? Yeah, you can charge whatever you want to charge for the most part. If you're the only one that has the temple shekels, it's the only place you can get it. Well, you could charge an exorbitant amount if you want to. We don't know that that's actually happened just yet. We're pretty sure it does happen because when you get to Matthew's story of the cleansing of the temple, Matthew has Jesus saying, "You've turned this into a den of robbers." Okay? So, Jesus was just righteously offended by the fact that these commercial industries were in places that were intended just for worship and community. I don't think Jesus had a problem that they did this, because this had to happen. People needed to be able to buy the animals they needed to sacrifice. They needed to change their money. Those things just need to happen. But to actually bring them in a place that was intended specifically for prayer and supposedly evangelism. Because if you remember, Isaiah 56 verse 7 says, "My house will be a prayer for all nations," for Gentiles. And so when Jesus walks into this area where Gentiles are supposed to be introduced to Judaism, given a taste, if you will, of monotheism, and be able to mingle with faithful Jews and see Jews praying for them and have an opportunity themselves to pray and to learn how to pray. Instead, what's happening is they're in these massive markets now. So there's really no room for the Gentiles to exercise any kind of faith, to learn anything about Judaism, except for the fact that these particular commercial markets were operating at such a high level, it hindered them from potentially having any kind of spiritual conversation, if that makes sense. So the answer Jesus had for that was, he just drove them all out, which is fascinating to me, that Jesus would make a whip, if you will, and drive the animals out. I'm not sure if he turned the doves loose, because once you turn them loose, I think they would be gone, right? So I'm not sure about that. But he did tell the people who were selling them to get out, turned over the tables where they were exchanging the money. So it was an act of righteous indignation. I think a lot of us would probably refer to it as a prophetic act. This is Jesus as prophet as well as Lord. Well, the Jews who see that, if you look at verse 18, they watch this, and it's interesting, when you read John's gospel, that's one of his favorite phrases, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, over and over and over and over. One of the reasons we believe that is because we think that by the time John wrote this gospel, there were a lot of Messianic Jews, which is what we would call them today, who were still worshiping in the synagogues, and they were being persecuted. And so John is sending a message to them, if you will, to the Jews who are doing the persecuting. But nevertheless, the Jews asked Jesus for a sign, and they wanted to know, how is it, verse 18, if we've got permission from Annas or Caiaphas, in other words, if we've got permission from the Sanhedrin to be here, who are you to run us out? Is basically what they're asking. On what authority are you doing these things? And of course, Jesus then answers them with this very encryptic kind of statement. He says, well, destroy this temple, and he says, and I will raise it again in 3 days. So that was a little bit challenging for them. And, their response to that was, King Herod started the expansion of this building 46 years ago. And the way Herod did that was, if y'all remember, Herod was not an actual real Jew. Herod was Idumean. Herod was from Esau, not Jacob. And so Herod always struggled with that. So here's what he did. He trained several thousand priests to do the masonry and the expansion of the temple. That way the Jews would accept it. In other words, they didn't have pagan construction workers or half-breed, if you want to call them that, Idumeans. He actually had Jewish priests oversee the expansion of the temple. That made it acceptable to the Jews. Does that make sense? So they had as much as Herod could be evil, there were many Jews who at least respected the fact that he honored their sensitivities when it came to the temple. Now, the one thing he also did was, though, he put the fortress of Antonia next to it, and it's taller than the temple. And so eventually the Roman soldiers would be stationed there because Herod, as well as the Romans, wanted to keep an eye on what the Jews were doing. So they could always look down on the temple to see what was taking place there. It's kind of interesting. But nevertheless, so these folks said, "No, wait a minute. You're telling us you're going to rebuild this in 3 days." You'll notice there's several times along the way in John's gospel when people misunderstand something and it only comes to light after the resurrection or in retrospect. Here's one of those examples. Even his disciples misunderstood this. They weren't sure what this meant. But John, it sounds like an eyewitness, says, well, after he was resurrected from the dead, we got it. He was talking about himself. He died, and 3 days later he's alive. And also John seems to be saying, and then we remembered that this passage out of Psalm 69, the zeal for the Lord's house will consume me. They're starting to call to mind messianic passages of Scripture in retrospect. And John goes ahead and records that for us. And then you have a really interesting play on words in John's gospel. If you look at verse 23, or verse 22 rather, the disciples believed. They embraced the Scripture and what Jesus said. Verse 23, then he says, there were people there who saw the signs and they believed. Same word. And then he says, but Jesus, same word, did not believe them. Did not believe in them. And so Jesus sees some of the people in Jerusalem who are willing to somehow or another want to come alongside him only because he was performing miracles. So what John is trying to tell us is they didn't really believe. And because of that, Jesus didn't even believe in them. And then I love how John will do this because John is one of the gospel writers that does this for us to help remind us who Jesus is. And he says, and nobody had to tell Jesus anything because he knew everything. He knew everybody. So it wasn't like he just knew the people in the temple. He knew everybody in Jerusalem. That's what John said. John is basically letting us all know many years later as he's reflecting on this, Jesus is God in the flesh. Don't forget that. He knew everything. And that's just a good word to us. Jesus knows everybody. So when did this happen? This is the question that has puzzled scholars ever since John wrote his gospel. Because here's the challenge. All four gospel writers record the cleansing of the temple. Every one of them. I have a listing there for you. Matthew 21, Mark 11, Luke 19. Matthew, Mark, and Luke placed the cleansing of the temple during Holy Week at the very end of the ministry of Jesus. Okay, so they record this event taking place at the very conclusion of his ministry. Here's the key questions here they are. Was there one temple cleansing or two? Did the gospel writers choose to place the story strategically for theological reasons, or are all of them chronological? So would be my answer to that. Because sometimes scholars, when they're studying the New Testament, if something gets repeated in another gospel, but it's at a different place than where it is in one of them, they usually want to give the gospel writer credit for being theologically motivated and not chronologically bound. That was not a problem in the ancient world. That was done often in the ancient world. We're a little more linear as Westerners in how we tend to tell the story. That's why you need to be very careful of Western linear thinking theologians who interpret the book of Revelation completely chronologically. Because many Western theologians interpret Revelation as if Luke wrote it, not John. John is way more artistic than Luke. I love Luke. Don't get me wrong. I'm a church historian. He's a church historian. I love it. We'll see Luke in heaven. We'll thank him for writing the book of Acts, right? First church historian. And you should. If you don't, we'll just do that, okay? You'll feel better about yourself if you do. Trust me. So I love Luke. Luke is left brain, though. Luke will say, Caesar Augustus was the emperor. Matter of fact, Quirinius was the governor of Syria. And Caesar Augustus sent out a decree in all the empire that everybody had to be taxed. You know, John the Baptist began his work in the 15th year of the reign of Caesar Tiberius. John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay? That's John. John is, and so when you're reading the book of Revelation, John will say something like this. Then I saw. Da-da-da-da-da. Then I saw. Da-da-da-da-da. He doesn't always say this happened and then next this is going to happen. He's just telling you what he sees. So that's why we have to be careful. That leads some theologians and scholars to read the New Testament and say, now wait a minute. Is John doing that here? Did he decide to take this story and just put it at the beginning because he thinks it fits better theologically? Does that make sense? Not that that would be an error, because in the ancient world, that was just a common way of telling stories. Here's what I think is the problem with that. I would argue, based on my study, I believe there are two cleansings of the temple. And I think we actually need them both. Because I think John records the first one at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus, and I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the one at the end of the ministry of Jesus. So a couple of reasons why I believe that. Look at verse 20 of chapter 2. They tell Jesus it's taken 46 years to build this temple. Well, based on when we believe Herod's temple started, that would put us about the year 28, 29, somewhere in there. But it's a very short window. It's not like 28 to 40. It's either 28 or 29. It's right there. So to me, that seems to coincide when Jesus was launching his ministry, connected to John the Baptist, because we have Luke's reference to the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar in Luke 3, verse 1. So John the Baptist began his ministry then, which puts us in about 28, 29. Which is best we all can agree on when we look at, we have a little bit of trouble when it comes to the BC AD, before Christ and in the year of our Lord. Because if y'all remember, Dionysius Exiguus, he's the guy that is the one who drew the calendar for us and said, here's when Jesus was born, and it changes, history split at that moment. But as best we can tell now, we think he was off by about 3 to 4 years. Okay, which means Jesus was probably born about 3 years before Christ. Okay, so just get that in your mind a little bit. It is what it is. But think about it. This was a medieval monk who was trying to capture all this, and he didn't have all the things that we have. The fact that he got that close is pretty amazing if you think about it. The point is, he might have been off by 2 or 3 years, but here's the truth. Regardless of where you are in those 4 or 5 year span, everything changed with the birth of Jesus, right? Everything before him is before Christ, okay, even if we're off by a couple of years. So if you use the best calendar that we have today, then we're probably around 28 or 29. And then give Jesus at least 2.5 years or maybe 3.5 years of ministry, and I think we're really more in the ballpark of timing. That means, based upon that, this cleansing had to have taken place at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. And it makes sense to me, because if you think about it, they didn't do anything to him when he did it. He had no reputation yet. Nobody in Jerusalem even really knew who he was. So he does this. They don't try to kill him. They're frustrated. They're questioning, perhaps a little bit angry, but there's no plot put in place because they have no evidence against him yet. Pretty much all he's done is given them 150 gallons of wine, if you think about it. And none of them were griping about that, I don't think. So he hasn't really established himself yet prophetically, so he's not really a controversial figure yet. Does that make sense? He's just getting started. And then he does this. And the temple's full of people. And Jerusalem's full of people at Passover, a lot of guests, a lot of out-of-town folks. So I would just say, I believe this happened at the beginning of his ministry. And it establishes something, I believe, about him at the beginning of his ministry. So then, also, I would add this. You get 3 years later, and Jesus is in front of the Sanhedrin, and they're asking, does anybody have a charge against Jesus that we can consider blasphemous? Because when you get to this cleansing, this recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they decide we're going to kill him. There's so much animosity that's built up now by this time. In other words, that we've had ample opportunity there, if you will. But we have a testimony given in Mark 14. Y'all remember one of the guys stood up and said, you know what? He said he was going to destroy the temple and the temple that's made by hands, and then 3 days later he would build it without a temple built by hands. Well, that's not what Jesus said. But if you think about it, it's been 3 years since this guy heard him say it. If it had been Monday, I think he probably remembered it word for word. It's been 3 years now. And what the Bible tells us, if the guy quoted it inaccurately, well, he had forgotten some of it. But I would also say that putting the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus shows us why there's so much animosity in Judea, in the south, against him. You don't really know that if all you have are the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Because Matthew, Mark, and Luke focus almost all their attention on the Galilean ministry of Jesus. Most of his time is in Perea and Galilee in those three Gospels. John is the one who gives us what's happened in Jerusalem and how much controversy there is in Jerusalem. So think about what we're going to learn about Jesus. As y'all been reading, hopefully, the Gospel of John, our daily Bible readings, reading Kurt's devotionals. By the way, great job, Kurt. Thank you for what you're doing for us. I read them every day. But Jesus is doing some interesting things over the course of these 2 to 3 years in Jerusalem. He's going to the feasts. He's standing up and saying things like, are y'all still thirsty? Let me give you something to drink. You've had this bread that was provided in the wilderness. Well, I'll give you bread. I'm the bread of heaven. Priests and leaders, you're not good shepherds. The people are like a sheep without a shepherd. I'm the good shepherd. So he has had an opportunity by the time, as we read John's gospel, to create a whole lot of controversy by the time you get to that second temple cleansing. So when that one happens, they've had enough. That was the final straw. Jesus has been challenging them. He has been debating them. He's been in and out of Jerusalem several times. He's attended all these festivals. And he was an unknown when he cleansed the temple the first time. He was well known when he cleansed it the second time. Does that make sense? So I think there are two cleansings. I don't think John put this here just because of a theological perspective. I think he puts it here because this is when it happened. And it's at the opening of the ministry of Jesus. And you might say, well, then why didn't the other gospel writers tell us about it? Well, great question. Why didn't the other gospel writers tell us about the raising of Lazarus? Or the Samaritan woman? Well, we don't know. These men were editing as they went along, trying to decide what to share, what to leave out. So that's the beauty of having four of them. We have a fuller representation of what happened. And so instead of trying to critique why any of them left anything out, I think we should celebrate that any of them put anything in. That'd be my take on it. The very fact that I can even read about it all these years later and have some clue about what Jesus, the most important man who ever lived, did, thank you. So go ahead and thank Matthew, Mark, and John when you see them. We don't just thank Luke. I think you should thank him first. But I think Matthew, Mark, and John deserve to be thanked as well. My sense is this putting the perspective that there are two cleansings just makes sense to me and helps me reconcile why there was so much animosity at the very end of the ministry of Jesus, okay, in Jerusalem per se. Then the question is, what does it all mean? Why did he do it? Either time, why did he do it? And so what I would say is this is what I'm watching Jesus do in John's gospel. He's walking through the life of Israel, and he is reinterpreting and reframing everything. Just pick anything that's special to them. Any tradition, anything that is kind of buried in their understanding of the law, what they might believe fulfillment of prophecy would look like. And Jesus just over and over and over reframes it all every time. Well, what can you do on the Sabbath or not do? Well, they had a whole oral law explaining what you could do and not do. And Jesus established himself as the Lord of the Sabbath, which meant he could do whatever he wanted to do. He could honor the Lord on the Sabbath. And if that meant healing a blind man, that's what he did. Because he was Lord of the Sabbath. If Jesus looked at the ritual water pots at that wedding, and all that water that was typically used for ceremonial cleansing that was supposed to be connected to the life of Israel. And the sense was at that time in Israel that the leaders had robbed the people of joy. And Jesus seemed to be saying, well, you're not going to find joy in these rituals anymore because they're now so polluted. I'll just turn all this into wine and symbolize the fact that I'm bringing something brand new. Well, he'll do that. If he goes to the temple, where you've got the leaders now who've taken a part of the temple that was designed to cultivate relationships with the nations and turn it into a Jewish marketplace, and Jesus says, you're not going to do that. I'm here to make things holy. I will stop that. I will cleanse it. And then I will show to you that the day is going to come when you're not going to need this temple because I'm the new temple. And you're going to follow me. And he even told his disciples, the day is coming when all this will be gone. And these stones will be one turned upon the other. Some of y'all in this room have been to Jerusalem. Guess what? He was right. All that's left is rubble. Now you have the Dome of the Rock, but I'm talking about the Jewish wall and the remnants of the old temple. They're gone. You know why? Because he's the new temple. Lazarus dies. And, Jesus, if y'all remember the story, we talked about this as a staff Monday in our devotional. The Jews weren't really sure how long it took for you to be dead. In the ancient world, they didn't have monitors like we do. And so it's possible that you might think somebody's dead and a day later they're not really dead. Here's what they decided. If you're 3 days dead, you're dead. Okay, if we hadn't seen anything in 3 days, you're dead. You remember what Jesus did? He waited until 4 days. Just to make sure everybody in town knew Lazarus is not sick. We're not going to all of a sudden go, oh my gosh, Lazarus is alive. No, he's dead. And Jesus shows up and he reframes death. He doesn't eradicate death yet. But he reframed it because all of a sudden he spoke his authority over and called Lazarus out of the tomb. One commentator I read years ago said that he was grateful Jesus called him by name because what if he'd have just said, come forth, and everybody come back to life? That would have been quite a party. But the point is, Jesus over and over and over is going to reframe everything. That's just what he does. I even told the staff this. The most hated symbol in Israel in the first century was a cross. It was a symbol of domination. It was a symbol of pagan authority. It was directly related to Persians and Romans. And it was such an awful symbol, the Romans were exempt from it, but not the Jews. And Jesus has so reframed it, a lot of us wear it around our necks today. We put it on the top of our churches because the cross symbolizes something to us. Jesus completely reframed it. That's just what he does. That's what he's doing here. He's demonstrating his holiness, and he's demonstrating he's the authority over this temple. And what he's communicating to Israel, he's not just the authority over Israel, he's the authority over the whole world. And this whole world is going to be drawn to him. And so one of the very first things he does prophetically is make room for the Gentiles. He cleans out the court of the Gentiles to give them ample opportunity to find their way to this God that he came to represent for us. So it's a powerful story. And I believe, as I said, I think there were two of them. Jesus is establishing his kingdom. And just so you know, he's king. He is. He's king. All right, I'm going to stop right there. Those of you online, blessings. We'll see you next week.